Chapter 4 of the Ball and the Cross. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 4. A Discussion at Dawn. The duelists had from their own point of view escaped or conquered the chief powers of the modern world. They had satisfied the magistrate, they had tied the tradesman neck and heels, and they had left the police behind. As far as their own feelings went, they had melted into a monstrous sea. They were but the fare and driver of one of the million hansoms that fill London streets. But they had forgotten something. They had forgotten journalism. They had forgotten that there exists in the modern world, perhaps for the first time in history, a class of people whose interest is not that things should happen well or happen badly, should happen successfully or happen unsuccessfully, should happen to the advantage of this party or the advantage of that part, but whose interest simply is that things should happen. It is the one great weakness of journalism as a picture of our modern existence that it must be a picture made up entirely of exceptions. We announce on flaring posters that a man has fallen off a scaffolding. We do not announce on flaring posters that a man has not fallen off a scaffolding. Yet this latter fact is fundamentally more exciting, as indicating that that moving tower of terror and mystery, a man, is still abroad upon the earth. That the man has not fallen off a scaffolding is really more sensational, and it is also some 1,000 times more common. But journalism cannot reasonably be expected thus to insist upon the permanent miracles. Busy editors cannot be expected to put on their posters, "Mr. Wilkinson still safe," or "Mr. Jones of Worthing not dead yet." They cannot announce the happiness of mankind at all. They cannot describe all the forks that are not stolen, or all the marriages that are not judiciously dissolved. Hence the complete picture they give of life is of necessity fallacious. They can only represent what is unusual. However democratic they may be, they are only concerned with the minority. The incident of the religious fanatic who broke a window on Ludgate Hill was alone enough to set them up in good copy for the night. But when the same man was brought before a magistrate and defied his enemy to mortal combat in the open court, then the columns would hardly hold the excruciating information, and the headlines were so large that there was hardly room for any of the text. The Daily Telegraph headed a column, "A Duel on Divinity," and there was a correspondence afterwards which lasted for months about whether police magistrates ought to mention religion. The Daily Mail in its dull, sensible way headed the events, "Wanted to fight for the Virgin." Mr. James Douglas in the Star, presuming on his knowledge of philosophical and theological terms, described the Christians' outbreak under the title of "Duelist and Duelist." The Daily News inserted a colorless account of the matter, but was pursued and eaten up for some weeks with letters from outlying ministers, headed "Murder and Mariolatry." But the journalistic temperature was steadily and consistently heated by all these influences. The journalists had tasted blood, prospectively, and were in the mood for more. Everything in the matter prepared them for further outbursts of moral indignation. And when a gasping reporter rushed in the last hours of the evening with the announcement that the two heroes of the police court had literally been found fighting in a London back garden, with a shopkeeper bound and gagged in the front of the house, the editors and sub-editors were stricken still as men are by great beatitudes. The next morning 5 or 6 of the great London dailies burst out simultaneously into great blossoms of eloquent leader writing. Towards the end all the leaders tended to be the same, but they all began differently. The Daily Telegraph, for instance, began, "There will be little difference among our readers or among all truly English and law-abiding men touching the," etc., etc. The Daily Mail said, "People must learn in the modern world to keep their theological differences to themselves. The fracas," etc., etc. The Daily News started, "Nothing could be more inimical to the cause of true religion than," etc., etc. The Times began with something about Celtic disturbances of the equilibrium of empire, and the Daily Express distinguished itself splendidly by omitting altogether so controversial a matter and substituting a leader about goloshes. And the morning after that, the editors and the newspapers were in such a state that, as the phrase is, there was no holding them. Whatever secret and elvish thing it is that broods over editors and suddenly turns their brains, that thing had seized on the story of the broken glass and the duel in the garden. It became monstrous and omnipresent, as do in our time the unimportant doings of the sect of the Agapemonites, or as did at an earlier time the dreary dishonesties of the Rhodesian financiers. Questions were asked about it, and even answered, in the House of Commons. The government was solemnly denounced in the papers for not having done something, nobody knew what, to prevent the window being broken. An enormous subscription was started to reimburse Mr. Gordon, the man who had been gagged in the shop. Mr. MacIan, one of the combatants, became for some mysterious reason singly and hugely popular as a comic figure in the comic papers and on the stage of the music hall. He was always represented, in defiance of fact, with red whiskers and a very red nose, and in full Highland costume; and a song, consisting of an unimaginable number of verses, in which his name was rhymed with Flatiron, the British Lion, Sly-un, Dandelion, Spy-un, with Cop in the next line, was sung to crowded houses every night. The papers developed a devouring thirst for the capture of the fugitives, and when they had not been caught for 48 hours, they suddenly turned the whole matter into a detective mystery. Letters under the heading, "Where are they?" poured in to every paper, with every conceivable kind of explanation, running them to earth in the Monument, the Twopenny Tube, Epping Forest, Westminster Abbey, rolled up in carpets at Shoolbred's, locked up in safes in Chancery Lane. Yes, the papers were very interesting, and Mr. Turnbull unrolled a whole bundle of them for the amusement of Mr. MacIan, as they sat on a high common to the north of London in the coming of the white dawn. The darkness in the east had been broken with a bar of grey. The bar of grey was split with a sword of silver, and morning lifted itself laboriously over London. From the spot where Turnbull and MacIan were sitting on one of the barren steeps behind Hampstead, they could see the whole of London shaping itself vaguely and largely in the grey and glowing light, until the white sun stood over it and it lay at their feet, the splendid monstrosity that it is. Its bewildering squares and parallelograms were compact and perfect as a Chinese puzzle, an enormous hieroglyphic which man must decipher or die. There fell upon both of them, but upon Turnbull more than the other, because he knew more what the scene signified, that quite indescribable sense as of a sublime and passionate and heart-moving futility, which is never evoked by deserts or dead men, or men neglected and barbarous, which can only be invoked by the sight of the enormous genius of man applied to anything other than the best. Turnbull, the old idealistic democrat, had so often reviled the democracy, and reviled them justly for their supineness, their snobbishness, their evil reverence for idle things. He was right enough, for our democracy has only one great fault: it is not democratic. And after denouncing so justly average modern men for so many years as sophists and as slaves, he looked down from an empty slope in Hampstead and saw what gods they are. Their achievement seemed all the more heroic and divine, because it seemed doubtful whether it was worth doing at all. There seemed to be something greater than mere accuracy in making such a mistake as London. And what was to be the end of it all? What was to be the ultimate transformation of this common and incredible London man, this workman on a tram in Battersea, his clerk on an omnibus in Cheapside? Turnbull, as he stared drearily, murmured to himself the words of the old atheistic and revolutionary Swinburne who had intoxicated his youth. And still we ask if God or man can loosen thee, Lazarus, bid thee rise up, Republican, and save thyself and all of us. But no disciple's tongue can say, if thou canst take our sins away. Turnbull shivered slightly as if behind the earthly morning he felt the evening of the world, the sunset of so many hopes. Those words were from Songs Before Sunrise. But Turnbull's songs at their best were songs after sunrise, and sunrise had been no such great thing after all. Turnbull shivered again in the sharp morning air. MacIan was also gazing with his face towards the city, but there was that about his blind and mystical stare that told one, so to speak, that his eyes were turned inwards. When Turnbull said something to him about London, they seemed to move as at a summons, and come out like two householders coming out into their doorways. "Yes," he said with a sort of stupidity, "it's a very big place." There was a somewhat unmeaning silence, and then MacIan said again, "It's a very big place. When I first came into it I was frightened of it. Frightened exactly as one would be frightened at the sight of a man 40 feet high. I am used to big things where I come from, big mountains that seem to fill God's infinity, and the big sea that goes to the end of the world. But then these things are all shapeless and confused things, not made in any familiar form. But to see the plain, square, human things as large as that, houses so large and streets so large, and the town itself so large, as like having screwed some devil's magnifying glass into one's eye. It was like seeing a porridge bowl as big as a house, or a mouse trap made to catch elephants." "Like the land of the Brobdingnagians," said Turnbull, smiling. "Oh, where is that?" said MacIan. Turnbull said bitterly, "In a book," and the silence fell suddenly between them again. They were sitting in a sort of litter on the hillside. All the things they had hurriedly collected in various places for their flight were strewn indiscriminately round them. The 2 swords with which they had lately sought each other's lives were flung down on the grass at random, like 2 idle walking sticks. Some provisions they had bought last night at a low public house, in case of undefined contingencies, were tossed about like the materials of an ordinary picnic, here a basket of chocolate, and there a bottle of wine. And to add to the disorder finally, there were strewn on top of everything the most disorderly of modern things, newspapers and more newspapers, and yet again newspapers, the ministers of the modern anarchy. Turnbull picked up one of them drearily and took out a pipe. "There's a lot about us," he said. "Do you mind if I light up?" "Why should I mind?" asked MacIan. Turnbull eyed with a certain studious interest the man who did not understand any of the verbal courtesies. He lit his pipe and blew great clouds out of it. "Yes," he resumed, "the matter on which you and I are engaged is at this moment really the best copy in England. I am a journalist, and I know. For the first time, perhaps, for many generations, the English are really more angry about a wrong thing done in England than they are about a wrong thing done in France." "It is not a wrong thing," said MacIan. Turnbull laughed. "You seem unable to understand the ordinary use of the human language. If I did not suspect that you were a genius, I should certainly know you were a blockhead. I fancy we had better be getting along and collecting our baggage." And he jumped up and began shoving the luggage into his pockets, or strapping it onto his back. As he thrust a tin of canned meat anyhow into his bursting side pocket, he said casually, "I only meant that you and I are the most prominent people in the English papers." "Well, what did you expect?" asked MacIan, opening his great grave blue eyes. "The papers are full of us," said Turnbull, stooping to pick up one of the swords. MacIan stooped and picked up the other. "Yes," he said in his simple way, "I have read what they have to say, but they don't seem to understand the point." "The point of what?" asked Turnbull. "The point of the sword," said MacIan violently, and planted the steel point in the soil like a man planting a tree. "That is a point," said Turnbull grimly, "that we will discuss later. Come along." Turnbull tied the last tin of biscuits desperately to himself with string, and then spoke, like a diver girt for plunging, short and sharp. "Now, Mr. MacIan, you must listen to me. You must listen to me not merely because I know the country, which you might learn by looking at a map, but because I know the people of the country, whom you could not know by living here 30 years. That infernal city down there is awake, and it is awake against us. All those endless rows of windows and windows are all eyes staring at us. All those forests of chimneys are fingers pointing at us, as we stand here on the hillside. This thing has caught on. For the next 6 mortal months they will think of nothing but us, as for 6 mortal months they thought of nothing but the Dreyfus case. Oh, I know it's funny. They let starving children who don't want to die drop by the score without looking round. But because 2 gentlemen, from private feelings of delicacy, do want to die, they will mobilize the Army and Navy to prevent them. For half a year or more, you and I, Mr. MacIan, will be an obstacle to every reform in the British Empire. We shall prevent the Chinese being sent out of the Transvaal, and the blocks being stopped in the Strand. We shall be the conversational substitute when anyone recommends Home Rule, or complains of sky signs. Therefore do not imagine in your innocence that we have only to melt away among those English hills as a Highland cateran might into your God-forsaken Highland mountains. We must be eternally on our guard. We must live the hunted life of 2 distinguished criminals. We must expect to be recognized as much as if we were Napoleon escaping from Elba. We must be prepared for our descriptions being sent to every tiny village, and for our faces being recognized by every ambitious policeman. We must often sleep under the stars as if we were in Africa. Last and most important, we must not dream of effecting our final settlement, which will be a thing as famous as the Phoenix Park murders, unless we have made real and precise arrangements for our isolation, I will not say our safety. We must not, in short, fight until we have thrown them off our scent, if only for a moment. For, take my word for it, Mr. MacIan, if the British public once catches us up, the British public will prevent the duel, if it is only by locking us both up in asylums for the rest of our days. MacIan was looking at the horizon with a rather misty look. I am not at all surprised, he said, at the world being against us. It makes me feel I was right to... Yes, said Turnbull. To smash your window, said MacIan. I have woken up the world. Very well, then, said Turnbull, stolidly. Let us look at a few final facts. Beyond that hill there is comparatively clear country. Fortunately, I know the part well, and if you will follow me exactly, and, when necessary, on your stomach, we may be able to get 10 miles out of London, literally without meeting anyone at all, which will be the best possible beginning at any rate. We have provisions for at least 2 days and 2 nights, 3 days if we do it carefully. We may be able to get 50 or 60 miles away without even walking into an inn door. I have the biscuits and the tinned meat and the milk. You have the chocolate, I think, and the brandy? Yes, said MacIan, like a soldier taking orders. Very well, then, come on. March. We turn under that 3rd bush and so down into the valley. And he set off ahead at a swinging walk. Then he stopped suddenly, for he realized that the other was not following. Evan MacIan was leaning on his sword with a lowering face, like a man suddenly smitten still with doubt. What on earth is the matter? Asked Turnbull, staring in some anger. Evan made no reply. What the deuce is the matter with you? Demanded the leader, again, his face slowly growing as red as his beard. Then he said suddenly, and in a more human voice, Are you in pain, MacIan? Yes, replied the Highlander, without lifting his face. Take some brandy, cried Turnbull, walking forward hurriedly towards him. You've got it. It's not in the body, said MacIan in his dull, strange way. The pain has come into my mind. A very dreadful thing has just come into my thoughts. What the devil are you talking about? Asked Turnbull. MacIan broke out with a queer and living voice. We must fight now, Turnbull. We must fight now. A frightful thing has come upon me, and I know it must be now and here. I must kill you here," he cried, with a sort of tearful rage impossible to describe. "Here, here, upon this blessed grass." "Why, you idiot," began Turnbull. "The hour has come, the black hour God meant for it. Quick, it will soon be gone. Quick!" And he flung the scabbard from him furiously, and stood with the sunlight sparkling along his sword. "You confounded fool!" repeated Turnbull. "Put that thing up again, you ass. People will come out of that house at the first clash of the steel." "One of us will be dead before they come," said the other hoarsely, "for this is the hour God meant." "Well, I never thought much of God," said the editor of the Atheist, losing all patience, "and I think less now. Never mind what God meant. Kindly enlighten my pagan darkness as to what the devil you mean." "The hour will soon be gone, in a moment it will be gone," said the madman. "It is now, now, now that I must nail your blaspheming body to the earth. Now, now that I must avenge Our Lady on her vile slanderer. Now or never, for the dreadful thought is in my mind." "And what thought," asked Turnbull with frantic composure, "occupies what you call your mind?" "I must kill you now," said the fanatic, "because—" "Well, because?" said Turnbull patiently. "Because I have begun to like you." Turnbull's face had a sudden spasm in the sunlight, a change so instantaneous that it left no trace behind it, and his features seemed still carved into a cold stare. But when he spoke again, he seemed like a man who was placidly pretending to misunderstand something that he understood perfectly well. "Your affection expresses itself in an abrupt form," he began, but MacIan broke the brittle and frivolous speech to pieces with a violent voice. "Do not trouble to talk like that," he said. "You know what I mean as well as I know it. Come on and fight, I say. Perhaps you are feeling just as I do." Turnbull's face flinched again in the fierce sunlight, but his attitude kept its contemptuous ease. "Your Celtic mind really goes too fast for me," he said. "Let me be permitted in my heavy Lowland way to understand this new development. My dear Mr. MacIan, what do you really mean?" MacIan still kept the shining sword point towards the other's breast. "You know what I mean. You mean the same yourself. We must fight now, or else—" "Or else?" repeated Turnbull, staring at him with an almost blinding gravity. "Or else we may not want to fight at all," answered Evan, and the end of his speech was like a despairing cry. Turnbull took out his own sword suddenly as if to engage. Then planting it point downwards for a moment, he said, "Before we begin, may I ask you a question?" MacIan bowed patiently, but with burning eyes. "You said just now," continued Turnbull, presently, "that if we did not fight now, we might not want to fight at all. How would you feel about the matter if we came not to want to fight at all?" "I should feel," answered the other, "just as I should feel if you had drawn your sword, and I had run away from it. I should feel that because I had been weak, justice had not been done." "Justice," answered Turnbull with a thoughtful smile. "But we are talking about your feelings. And what do you mean by justice apart from your feelings?" MacIan made a gesture of weary recognition. "Oh, nominalism," he said with a sort of sigh. "We had all that out in the 12th century." "I wish we could have it out now," replied the other firmly. "Do you really mean that if you came to think me right, you would be certainly wrong?" "If I had a blow on the back of my head, I might come to think you a green elephant," answered MacIan. "But have I not the right to say now that if I thought that I should think wrong?" "Then you are quite certain that it would be wrong to like me?" asked Turnbull with a slight smile. "No," said Evan, thoughtfully, "I do not say that. It may not be the devil, it may be some part of God I am not meant to know. But I had a work to do, and it is making the work difficult." "And I suppose," said the atheist quite gently, "that you and I know all about which part of God we ought to know." MacIan burst out like a man driven back and explaining everything. "The Church is not a thing like the Athenaeum Club," he cried. "If the Athenaeum Club lost all its members, the Athenaeum Club would dissolve and cease to exist. But when we belong to the Church, we belong to something which is outside all of us, which is outside everything you talk about, outside the cardinals and the Pope. They belong to it, but it does not belong to them. If we all fell dead suddenly, the Church would still somehow exist in God. Confound it all, don't you see that I am more sure of its existence than I am of my own existence? And yet you ask me to trust my temperament, my own temperament, which can be turned upside down by 2 bottles of claret or an attack of the jaundice. You ask me to trust that when it softens towards you, and not to trust the thing which I believe to be outside myself and more real than the blood in my body." "Stop a moment," said Turnbull, in the same easy tone. "Even in the very act of saying that you believe this or that, you imply that there is a part of yourself that you trust even if there are many parts which you mistrust. If it is only you that like me, surely, also, it is only you that believe in the Catholic Church." Evan remained in an unmoved and grave attitude. "There is a part of me which is divine," he answered, "a part that can be trusted, but there are also affections which are entirely animal and idle." "And you are quite certain, I suppose," continued Turnbull, "that if even you esteem me, the esteem would be wholly animal and idle?" For the first time MacIan started, as if he had not expected the thing that was said to him. At last he said, "Whatever in earth or heaven it is that has joined us two together, it seems to be something which makes it impossible to lie. No, I do not think that the movement in me towards you was that surface sort of thing. It may have been something deeper, something strange. I cannot understand the thing at all. But understand this, and understand it thoroughly, if I loved you my love might be divine. No, it is not some trifle that we are fighting about. It is not some superstition or some symbol. When you wrote those words about Our Lady, you were in that act a wicked man doing a wicked thing. If I hate you, it is because you have hated goodness. And if I like you, it is because you are good." Turnbull's face wore an indecipherable expression. "Well, shall we fight now?" he said. "Yes," said MacIan, with a sudden contraction of his black brows. "Yes, it must be now." The bright swords crossed, and the first touch of them, travelling down blade and arm, told each combatant that the heart of the other was awakened. It was not in that way that the swords rang together when they had rushed on each other in the little garden behind the dealer's shop. There was a pause, and then MacIan made a movement as if to thrust, and almost at the same moment Turnbull suddenly and calmly dropped his sword. Evan stared round in an unusual bewilderment, and then realized that a large man in pale clothes and a Panama hat was strolling serenely towards them. End of chapter 4. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 5. The Peacemaker. When the combatants, with crossed swords, became suddenly conscious of a third party, they each made the same movement. It was as quick as the snap of a pistol, and they altered it instantaneously and recovered their original pose, but they had both made it, they had both seen it, and they both knew what it was. It was not a movement of anger at being interrupted. Say or think what they would, it was a movement of relief. A force within them, and yet quite beyond them, seemed slowly and piteously washing away the adamant of their oath. As mistaken lovers might watch the inevitable sunset of first love, these men watched the sunset of their first hatred. Their hearts were growing weaker and weaker against each other. When their weapons rang and riposted in the little London garden, they could have been very certain that if a third party had interrupted them something at least would have happened. They would have killed each other, or they would have killed him. But now nothing could undo or deny that flash of fact that for a second they had been glad to be interrupted. Some new and strange thing was rising higher and higher in their hearts like a high sea at night. It was something that seemed all the more merciless because it might turn out an enormous mercy. Was there, perhaps, some such fatalism in friendship as all lovers talk about in love? Did God make men love each other against their will? "I'm sure you'll excuse my speaking to you," said the stranger, in a voice at once eager and deprecating. The voice was too polite for good manners. It was incongruous with the eccentric spectacle of the duellists which ought to have startled a sane and free man. It was also incongruous with the full and healthy, though rather loose physique of the man who spoke. At the first glance he looked a fine animal, with curling gold beard and hair, and blue eyes, unusually bright. It was only at the second glance that the mind felt a sudden and perhaps unmeaning irritation at the way in which the gold beard retreated backwards into the waistcoat, and the way in which the finely shaped nose went forward as if smelling its way. And it was only, perhaps, at the 100th glance that the bright blue eyes, which normally before and after the instant seemed brilliant with intelligence, seemed as it were to be brilliant with idiocy. He was a heavy, healthy-looking man, who looked all the larger because of the loose, light-colored clothes that he wore, and that had in their extreme lightness and looseness almost a touch of the tropics. But a closer examination of his attire would have shown that even in the tropics it would have been unique, but it was all woven according to some hygienic texture which no human being had ever heard of before, and which was absolutely necessary even for a day's health. He wore a huge broad-rimmed hat, equally hygienic, very much at the back of his head, and his voice coming out of so heavy and hearty a type of man was, as I have said, startlingly shrill and deferential. "I'm sure you'll excuse my speaking to you," he said. "Now, I wonder if you are in some little difficulty which, after all, we could settle very comfortably together. Now, you don't mind my saying this, do you?" The face of both combatants remained somewhat solid under this appeal, but the stranger, probably taking their silence for a gathering shame, continued with a kind of gaiety. "So you are the young men I have read about in the papers. Well, of course, when one is young one is rather romantic. Do you know what I always say to young people?" A blank silence followed this gay inquiry. Then Turnbull said in a colorless voice, "As I was 47 last birthday, I probably came into the world too soon for the experience." Very good," said the friendly person. Dry Scotch humor. Well now, I understand that you two people want to fight a duel. I suppose you aren't much up in the modern world. We've quite outgrown dueling, you know. In fact, Tolstoy tells us that we shall soon outgrow war, which he says is simply a duel between nations. A duel between nations. But there is no doubt about our having outgrown dueling." Waiting for some effect upon his wooden auditors, the stranger stood beaming for a moment, and then resumed. "Now, they tell me in the papers that you are really wanting to fight about something connected with Roman Catholicism. Now, do you know what I always say to Roman Catholics?" "No," said Turnbull heavily. "Do they?" It seemed to be a characteristic of the hearty, hygienic gentleman that he always forgot the speech he had made the moment before. Without enlarging further on the fixed form of his appeal to the Church of Rome, he laughed cordially at Turnbull's answer. Then his wandering blue eyes caught the sunlight on the swords, and he assumed a good-humored gravity. "But you know this is a serious matter," he said, eyeing Turnbull and MacIan, as if they had just been keeping the table in a roar with their frivolities. "I am sure that if I appealed to your higher natures, every man has a higher nature and a lower nature. Now let us put the matter very plainly, and without any romantic nonsense about honor or anything of that sort. Is not bloodshed a great sin?" "No," said MacIan, speaking for the first time. "Well, really," said the peacemaker. "Murder is a sin," said the immovable Highlander. "There is no sin of bloodshed." "Well, we won't quarrel about a word," said the other pleasantly. "Why on earth not?" said MacIan, with a sudden asperity. "Why shouldn't we quarrel about a word? What is the good of words if they aren't important enough to quarrel over? Why do we choose one word more than another if there isn't any difference between them? If you called a woman a chimpanzee instead of an angel, wouldn't there be a quarrel about a word? If you're not going to argue about words, what are you going to argue about? Are you going to convey your meaning to me by moving your ears? The Church and the heresies always used to fight about words, because they are the only things worth fighting about. I say that murder is a sin and bloodshed is not, and that there is as much difference between those words as there is between the word yes and the word no. Or rather more difference, for yes and no at least belong to the same category. Murder is a spiritual incident. Bloodshed is a physical incident. A surgeon commits bloodshed." "Ah, you're a casuist," said the large man, wagging his head. "Now, do you know what I always say to casuists?" MacIan made a violent gesture, and Turnbull broke into open laughter. The peacemaker did not seem to be in the least annoyed, but continued in unabated enjoyment. "Well, well," he said, "let us get back to the point. Now Tolstoy has shown that force is no remedy, so you see the position in which I am placed. I am doing my best to stop what I'm sure you won't mind my calling this really useless violence, this really quite wrong violence of yours. But it's against my principles to call in the police against you, because the police are still on a lower moral plane, so to speak, because, in short, the police undoubtedly sometimes employ force. Tolstoy has shown that violence merely breeds violence in the person towards whom it is used, whereas love, on the other hand, breeds love. So you see how I am placed. I am reduced to use love in order to stop you. I am obliged to use love." He gave to the word an indescribable sound of something hard and heavy, as if he were saying boots. Turnbull suddenly gripped his sword and said shortly, "I see how you are placed quite well, sir. You will not call the police. Mr. MacIan, shall we engage?" MacIan plucked his sword out of the grass. "I must and will stop this shocking crime!" cried the Tolstoyan, crimson in the face. "It is against all modern ideas. It is against the principle of love. How you, sir, who pretend to be a Christian—" MacIan turned upon him with a white face and bitter lip. "Sir," he said, "talk about the principle of love as much as you like. You seem to me colder than a lump of stone. But I am willing to believe that you may at some time have loved a cat or a dog or a child. When you were a baby, I suppose you loved your mother. Talk about love then, till the world is sick of the word. But don't you talk about Christianity. Don't you dare to say one word, white or black, about it. Christianity is, as far as you are concerned, a horrible mystery. Keep clear of it, keep silent upon it, as you would upon an abomination. It is a thing that has made men slay and torture each other, and you will never know why. It is a thing that has made men do evil that good might come, and you will never understand the evil, let alone the good. Christianity is a thing that could only make you vomit, till you are other than you are. I would not justify it to you even if I could. Hate it, in God's name, as Turnbull does, who is a man. It is a monstrous thing for which men die. And if you will stand here and talk about love for another 10 minutes, it is very probable that you will see a man die for it." And he fell on guard. Turnbull was busy settling something loose in his elaborate hilt, and the pause was broken by the stranger. "Suppose I call the police?" he said, with a heated face. "And deny your most sacred dogma," said MacIan. "Dogma!" cried the man in a sort of dismay. "Oh, we have no dogmas, you know." There was another silence, and he said again, airily, "You know, I think, there's something in what Shaw teaches about no moral principles being quite fixed. Have you ever read the Quintessence of Ibsenism? Of course he went very wrong over the war." Turnbull, with a bent, flushed face, was tying up the loose piece of the pommel with string. With the string in his teeth, he said, "Oh, make up your damned mind and clear out." "It's a serious thing," said the philosopher, shaking his head. "I must be alone and consider which is the higher point of view. I rather feel that in a case so extreme as this—" and he went slowly away. As he disappeared among the trees, they heard him murmuring in a sing-song voice, "New occasions teach new duties," out of a poem by James Russell Lowell. "Ah," said MacIan, drawing a deep breath, "don't you believe in prayer now? I prayed for an angel. An hour ago," said the Highlander, in his heavy meditative voice, "I felt the devil weakening my heart and my oath against you, and I prayed that God would send an angel to my aid." "Well?" inquired the other, finishing his mending and wrapping the rest of the string round his hand to get a firmer grip. "Well?" "Well, that man was an angel," said MacIan. "I didn't know they were as bad as that," answered Turnbull. "We know that devils sometimes quote Scripture and counterfeit good," replied the mystic. "Why should not angels sometimes come to show us the black abyss of evil on whose brink we stand? If that man had not tried to stop us, I might have stopped." "I know what you mean," said Turnbull, grimly. "But then he came," broke out MacIan, "and my soul said to me, 'Give up fighting and you will become like that. Give up vows and dogmas and fixed things and you may grow like that. You may learn also that fog of false philosophy. You may grow fond of that mire of crawling, cowardly morals, and you may come to think a blow bad because it hurts and not because it humiliates. You may come to think murder wrong because it is violent and not because it is unjust. O you blasphemer of the good, an hour ago I almost loved you. But do not fear for me now. I have heard the word love pronounced in his intonation, and I know exactly what it means. On guard!" The swords caught on each other with a dreadful clang and jar, full of the old energy and hate; and at once plunged and replunged. Once more each man's heart had become the magnet of a mad sword. Suddenly, furious as they were frozen for a moment motionless. "What noise is that?" said the Highlander, hoarsely. "I think I know," replied Turnbull. "What? What?" cried the other. "The student of Shaw and Tolstoy has made up his remarkable mind," said Turnbull, quietly. "The police are coming up the hill." End of Chapter 5. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 6. The Other Philosopher. Between high hedges in Hertfordshire, hedges so high as to create a kind of grove, two men were running. They did not run in a scampering or feverish manner, but in the steady swing of the pendulum. Across the great plains and uplands to the right and left of the lane, a long tide of sunset light rolled like a sea of ruby, lighting up the long terraces of the hills and picking out the few windows of the scattered hamlets in startling blood-red sparks. But the lane was cut deep in the hill and remained in an abrupt shadow. The two men running in it had an impression not uncommonly experienced between those wild green English walls, a sense of being led between the walls of a maze. Though their pace was steady it was vigorous. Their faces were heated and their eyes fixed and bright. There was, indeed, something a little mad in the contrast between the evening stillness over the empty countryside and these two figures fleeing wildly from nothing. They had the look of two lunatics. Possibly they were. "Are you all right?" said Turnbull, with civility. "Can you keep this up?" "Quite easily, thank you," replied MacIan. "I run very well." "Is that a qualification in a family of warriors?" asked Turnbull. "Undoubtedly. Rapid movement is essential," answered MacIan, who never saw a joke in his life. Turnbull broke out into a short laugh, and silence fell between them, the panting silence of runners. Then MacIan said, "We run better than any of those policemen. They are too fat. Why do you make your policemen so fat?" "I didn't do much towards making them fat myself," replied Turnbull genially, "but I flatter myself that I am now doing something towards making them thin. You'll see they will be as lean as rakes by the time they catch us. They will look like your friend Cardinal Manning." "But they won't catch us," said MacIan in his literal way. "No, we beat them in the great military art of running away," returned the other. "They won't catch us unless—" MacIan turned his long equine face inquiringly. "Unless what?" he said, for Turnbull had gone silent suddenly, and seemed to be listening intently as he ran as a horse does with his ears turned back. "Unless what?" repeated the Highlander. "Unless they do what they have done. Listen!" MacIan slackened his trot and turned his head to the trail they had left behind them. Across 2 or 3 billows of the up and down lane came along the ground the unmistakable throbbing of horses' hoofs. "They have put the mounted police on us," said Turnbull shortly. "Good Lord, one would think we were a revolution." "So we are," said MacIan calmly. "What shall we do? Shall we turn on them with our points?" "It may come to that," answered Turnbull, "though if it does I reckon that will be the last act. We must put it off if we can." And he stared and peered about him between the bushes. "If we could hide somewhere the beasts might go by us," he said. "The police have their faults, but thank God they're inefficient. Why, here's the very thing. Be quick and quiet. Follow me." He suddenly swung himself up the high bank on one side of the lane. It was almost as high and smooth as a wall, and on the top of it the black hedge stood out over them as an angle, almost like a thatched roof of the lane. And the burning evening sky looked down at them through the tangle with red eyes as of an army of goblins. Turnbull hoisted himself up and broke the hedge with his body. As his head and shoulders rose above it, they turned to flame in the full glow as if lit up by an immense firelight. His red hair and beard looked almost scarlet, and his pale face as bright as a boy's. Something violent, something that was at once love and hatred, surged in the strange heart of the Gael below him. He had an unutterable sense of epic importance, as if he were somehow lifting all humanity into a prouder and more passionate region of the air. As he swung himself up also into the evening light, he felt as if he were rising on enormous wings. Legends of the morning of the world which he had heard in childhood or read in youth came back upon him in a cloudy splendor, purple tales of wrath and friendship, like Roland and Oliver, or Balin and Balan, reminding him of emotional entanglements. Men who had loved each other and then fought each other. Men who had fought each other and then loved each other, together made a mixed but monstrous sense of momentousness. The crimson seas of the sunset seemed to him like a bursting out of some sacred blood, as if the heart of the world had broken. Turnbull was wholly unaffected by any written or spoken poetry. His was a powerful and prosaic mind. But even upon him there came for the moment something out of the earth and the passionate ends of the sky. The only evidence was in his voice, which was still practical but a shade more quiet. "Do you see that summer-house looking thing over there?" he asked shortly. "That will do for us very well." Keeping himself free from the tangle of the hedge, he strolled across a triangle of obscure kitchen garden, and approached a dismal shed or lodge a yard or two beyond it. It was a weather-stained hut of grey wood, which with all its desolation retained a tag or two of trivial ornament, which suggested that the thing had once been a sort of summer-house, and the place probably a sort of garden. "That is quite invisible from the road," said Turnbull as he entered it, "and it will cover us up for the night." MacIan looked at him gravely for a few moments. "Sir," he said, "I ought to say something to you. I ought to say—" "Hush!" said Turnbull, suddenly lifting his hand. "Be still, man." In the sudden silence the drumming of the distant horses grew louder and louder with inconceivable rapidity, and the cavalcade of police rushed by below them in the lane almost with the roar and rattle of an express train. I ought to tell you, continued MacIan, still staring stolidly at the other, that you are a great chief, and it is good to go to war behind you. Turnbull said nothing, but turned and looked out of the foolish lattice of the little windows, then he said, "We must have food and sleep first." When the last echo of their eluded pursuers had died in the distant uplands, Turnbull began to unpack the provisions with the easy air of a man at a picnic. He had just laid out the last items, put a bottle of wine on the floor and a tin of salmon on the window ledge, when the bottomless silence of that forgotten place was broken. And it was broken by 3 heavy blows of a stick delivered upon the door. Turnbull looked up in the act of opening a tin and stared silently at his companion. MacIan's long, lean mouth had shut hard. "Who the devil can it be?" said Turnbull. "God knows," said the other. "It might be God." Again the sound of the wooden stick reverberated on the wooden door. It was a curious sound, and on consideration did not resemble the ordinary effects of knocking on a door for admittance. It was rather as if the point of a stick were plunged again and again at the panels in an absurd attempt to make a hole in them. A wild look sprang into MacIan's eyes, and he got up half stupidly, with a kind of stagger, put his hand out and caught one of the swords. "Let us fight at once," he cried. "It is the end of the world." "You're overdone, MacIan," said Turnbull, putting him on one side. "It's only someone playing the goat. Let me open the door." But he also picked up a sword as he stepped to open it. He paused one moment with his hand on the handle, and then flung the door open. Almost as he did so, the ferrule of an ordinary bamboo cane came at his eyes, so that he had actually to parry it with the naked weapon in his hands. As the two touched, the point of the stick was dropped very abruptly, and the man with the stick stepped hurriedly back. Against the heraldic background of sprawling crimson and gold offered him by the expiring sunset, the figure of the man with the stick showed at first merely black and fantastic. He was a small man with 2 wisps of long hair that curled up on each side, and seen in silhouette, looked like horns. He had a bow tie so big that the 2 ends showed on each side of his neck like unnatural stunted wings. He had his long black cane still tilted in his hand like a fencing foil and half presented at the open door. His large straw hat had fallen behind him as he leapt backwards. "With reference to your suggestion, MacIan," said Turnbull placidly, "I think it looks more like the devil." "Who on earth are you?" cried the stranger in a high shrill voice, brandishing his cane defensively. "Let me see," said Turnbull, looking round to MacIan with the same blandness. "Who are we?" "Come out!" screamed the little man with the stick. "Certainly," said Turnbull, and went outside with the sword, MacIan following. Seen more fully, with the evening light on his face, the strange man looked a little less like a goblin. He wore a square pale grey jacket suit, on which the grey butterfly tie was the only indisputable touch of affectation. Against the great sunset his figure had looked merely small; seen in a more equal light, it looked tolerably compact and shapely. His reddish-brown hair, combed into 2 great curls, looked like the long, slow-curling hair of the women in some pre-Raphaelite pictures. But within this feminine frame of hair his face was unexpectedly impudent, like a monkey's. "What are you doing here?" he said, in a sharp small voice. "Well," said MacIan in his grave childish way, "what are you doing here?" "I," said the man indignantly, "I'm in my own garden." "Oh," said MacIan simply, "I apologize." Turnbull was coolly curling his red moustache, and the stranger stared from one to the other, temporarily stunned by their innocent assurance. "But may I ask," he said at last, "what the devil you are doing in my summer house?" "Certainly," said MacIan, "we were just going to fight." "To fight!" repeated the man. "We had better tell this gentleman the whole business," broke in Turnbull. Then turning to the stranger he said firmly, "I am sorry, sir, but we have something to do that must be done, and I may as well tell you at the beginning, and to avoid waste of time or language, that we cannot admit any interference. We were just going to take some slight refreshment when you interrupted us. The little man had a dawning expression of understanding, and stooped and picked up the unused bottle of wine, eyeing it curiously. Turnbull continued: "But that refreshment was preparatory to something which I fear you will find less comprehensible, but on which our minds are entirely fixed, sir. We are forced to fight a duel. We are forced by honor and an internal intellectual need. Do not, for your own sake, attempt to stop us. I know all the excellent and ethical things that you will want to say to us. I know all about the essential requirements of civil order. I have written leading articles about them all my life. I know all about the sacredness of human life. I have bored all my friends with it. Try and understand our position. This man and I are alone in the modern world in that we think that God is essentially important. I think he does not exist. That is where the importance comes in for me. But this man thinks that he does exist, and thinking that very properly thinks him more important than anything else. Now we wish to make a great demonstration and assertion, something that will set the world on fire like the first Christian persecutions. If you like, we are attempting a mutual martyrdom. The papers have posted up every town against us. Scotland Yard has fortified every police station with our enemies. We are driven therefore to the edge of a lonely lane, and indirectly to taking liberties with your summer house in order to arrange our—" "Stop!" roared the little man in the butterfly necktie. "Put me out of my intellectual misery. Are you really the two tomfools I have read of in all the papers? Are you the two people who wanted to spit each other in the police court? Are you? Are you?" "Yes," said MacIan, "it began in a police court." The little man slung the bottle of wine 20 yards away like a stone. "Come up to my place," he said. "I've got better stuff than that. I've got the best bone within 50 miles of here. Come up. You're the very men I wanted to see." Even Turnbull, with his typical invulnerability, was a little taken aback by this boisterous and almost brutal hospitality. "Why, sir," he began. "Come up! Come in!" howled the little man, dancing with delight. "I'll give you a dinner. I'll give you a bed. I'll give you a green smooth lawn and your choice of swords and pistols. Why, you fools, I adore fighting. It's the only good thing in God's world. I've walked about these damned fields and longed to see somebody cut up and killed and the blood running. Ha, ha!" And he made sudden lunges with his stick at the trunk of a neighboring tree, so that the ferrule made fierce prints and punctures in the bark. "Excuse me," said MacIan suddenly with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child, "excuse me, but—" "Well?" said the small fighter, brandishing his wooden weapon. "Excuse me," repeated MacIan, "but was that what you were doing at the door?" The little man stared an instant and then said, "Yes," and Turnbull broke into a guffaw. "Come on!" cried the little man, tucking his stick under his arm and taking quite suddenly to his heels. "Come on! Confound me, I'll see both of you eat, and then I'll see one of you die. Lord bless me, the gods must exist after all. They have sent me one of my daydreams. Lord, a duel!" He had gone flying along a winding path between the borders of the kitchen garden, and in the increasing twilight he was as hard to follow as a flying hare. But at length the path after many twists betrayed its purpose, and led abruptly up 2 or 3 steps to the door of a tiny but very clean cottage. There was nothing about the outside to distinguish it from other cottages, except indeed its ominous cleanliness, and one thing that was out of all the custom and tradition of all cottages under the sun. In the middle of the little garden among the stocks and marigolds, there surged up in shapeless stone a South Sea Island idol. There was something gross and even evil in that eyeless and alien god among the most innocent of the English flowers. "Come in!" cried the creature again. "Come in! It's better inside!" Whether or no it was better inside, it was at least a surprise. The moment the two duelists had pushed open the door of that inoffensive, whitewashed cottage, they found that its interior was lined with fiery gold. It was like stepping into a chamber in the Arabian Nights. The door that closed behind them shut out England and all the energies of the West. The ornaments that shone and shimmered on every side of them were subtly mixed from many periods and lands, but were all Oriental. Cruel Assyrian bas-reliefs ran along the sides of the passage. Cruel Turkish swords and daggers glinted above and below them. The two were separated by ages and fallen civilizations, yet they seemed to sympathize, since they were both harmonious and both merciless. The house seemed to consist of chamber within chamber, and created that impression as of a dream which belongs also to the Arabian Nights themselves. The innermost room of all was like the inside of a jewel. The little man who owned it all threw himself on a heap of scarlet and golden cushions, and struck his hands together. A negro in a white robe and turban appeared suddenly and silently behind them. "Selim," said the host, "these two gentlemen are staying with me tonight. Send up the very best wine and dinner at once. And Selim, one of these gentlemen will probably die tomorrow. Make arrangements, please." The negro bowed and withdrew. Evan MacIan came out the next morning into the little garden to a fresh silver day, his long face looking more austere than ever in that cold light, his eyelids a little heavy. He carried one of the swords. Turnbull was in the little house behind him, demolishing the end of an early breakfast and humming a tune to himself, which could be heard through the open window. A moment or two later he leapt to his feet and came out into the sunlight, still munching toast, his own sword stuck under his arm like a walking-stick. Their eccentric host had vanished from sight, with a polite gesture, some 20 minutes before. They imagined him to be occupied on some concerns in the interior of the house, and they waited for his emergence, stamping the garden in silence, the garden of tall, fresh country flowers, in the midst of which the monstrous South Sea idol lifted itself as abruptly as the prow of a ship riding on a sea of red and white and gold. It was with a start, therefore, that they came upon the man himself already in the garden. They were all the more startled because of the still posture in which they found him. He was on his knees in front of the stone idol, rigid and motionless, like a saint in a trance or ecstasy. Yet when Turnbull's tread broke a twig, he was on his feet in a flash. "Excuse me," he said with an irradiation of smiles, but yet with a kind of bewilderment. "So sorry, family prayers, old-fashioned, mother's knee. Let us go on to the lawn behind." And he ducked rapidly round the statue to an open space of grass on the other side of it. "This will do us best, Mr. MacIan," said he. Then he made a gesture towards the heavy stone figure on the pedestal, which had now its blank and shapeless back turned towards them. "Don't you be afraid," he added, "he can still see us." MacIan turned his blue, blinking eyes, which seemed still misty with sleep, or sleeplessness, towards the idol, but his brows drew together. The little man with the long hair also had his eyes on the back view of the god. His eyes were at once liquid and burning, and he rubbed his hands slowly against each other. "Do you know," he said, "I think he can see us better this way. I often think that this blank thing is his real face, watching, though it can't be watched. He, he! Yes, I think he looks nice from behind. He looks more cruel from behind, don't you think?" "What the devil is the thing?" asked Turnbull gruffly. "It is the only thing there is," answered the other. "It is force." "Oh," said Turnbull shortly. "Yes, my friends?" said the little man with an animated countenance, fluttering his fingers in the air, "it was no chance that led you to this garden. Surely it was the caprice of some old god, some happy, pitiless god. Perhaps it was his will, for he loves blood. And on that stone in front of him men have been butchered by hundreds in the fierce, feasting islands of the south. In this cursed craven place I have not been permitted to kill men on his altar, only rabbits and cats sometimes." In the stillness MacIan made a sudden movement, unmeaning apparently, and then remained rigid. "But today, today!" continued the small man in a shrill voice. "Today his hour is come. Today his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. Men will bleed before him today." And he bit his forefinger in a kind of fever. Still the two duelists stood with their swords as heavily as statues, and the silence seemed to cool the eccentric and call him back to more rational speech. "Perhaps I express myself a little too lyrically," he said with an amicable abruptness. "My philosophy has its higher ecstasies, but perhaps you are hardly worked up to them yet. Let us confine ourselves to the unquestioned. You have found your way, gentlemen, by a beautiful accident, to the house of the only man in England, probably, who will favor and encourage your most reasonable project. From Cornwall to Cape Wrath, this country is one horrible, solid block of humanitarianism. You will find men who will defend this or that war in a distant continent. They will defend it on the contemptible ground of commerce, or the more contemptible ground of social good. But do not fancy that you will find one other person who will comprehend a strong man taking the sword in his hand and wiping out his enemy. My name is Wimpey, Maurice Wimpey. I had a fellowship at Magdalen. But I assure you I had to drop it, owing to my having said something in a public lecture infringing the popular prejudice against those great gentlemen, the assassins of the Italian Renaissance. They let me say it at dinner and so on, and seemed to like it, but in a public lecture, so inconsistent. Well, as I say, here is your only refuge and temple of honor. Here you can fall back on that naked and awful arbitration which is the only thing that balances the stars, a still, continuous violence. Vae victis! Down, down, down with the defeated! Victory is the only ultimate fact. Carthage was destroyed, the Red Indians are being exterminated. It is the single certainty. In an hour from now, that sun will still be shining and that grass growing, and one of you will be conquered. One of you will be the conqueror. When it has been done, nothing will alter it. Heroes, I give you the hospitality fit for heroes, and I salute the survivor. Fall on!" The two men took their swords. Then MacIan said steadily, "Mr. Turnbull, lend me your sword a moment." Turnbull, with a questioning glance, handed him the weapon. MacIan took the second sword in his left hand, and, with a violent gesture, hurled it at the feet of little Mr. Wimpey. "Fight!" he said, in a loud, harsh voice. "Fight me now!" Wimpey took a step backward, and bewildered words bubbled on his lips. "Pick up that sword and fight me," repeated MacIan, with brows as black as thunder. The little man turned to Turnbull with a gesture, demanding judgment or protection. "Really, sir," he began, "this gentleman confuses—" "You stinking little coward!" roared Turnbull, suddenly releasing his wrath. "Fight if you're so fond of fighting. Fight if you're so fond of all that filthy philosophy. If winning is everything, go in and win. If the weak must go to the wall, go to the wall. Fight, you rat! Fight, or if you won't fight, run!" And he ran at Wimpey with blazing eyes. Wimpey staggered back a few paces like a man struggling with his own limbs. Then he felt the furious Scotchman coming at him like an express train, doubling his size every second, with eyes as big as windows and a sword as bright as the sun. Something broke inside him, and he found himself running away, tumbling over his own feet in terror, and crying out as he ran. "Chase him!" shouted Turnbull, as MacIan snatched up the sword and joined in the scamper. "Chase him over a county! Chase him into the sea! Shoo! Shoo! Shoo!" The little man plunged like a rabbit among the tall flowers, the two duelists after him. Turnbull kept at his tail with savage ecstasy, still shooing him like a cat. But MacIan, as he ran past the South Sea idol, paused an instant to spring upon its pedestal. For 5 seconds he strained against the inert mass. Then it stirred, and he sent it over with a great crash among the flowers that engulfed it altogether. Then he went bounding after the runaway. In the energy of his alarm the ex-fellow of Magdalen managed to leap the paling of his garden. The two pursuers went over it after him like flying birds. He fled frantically down a long lane with his two terrors on his tail till he came to a gap in the hedge and went across a steep meadow like the wind. The two Scotchmen, as they ran, kept up a cheery bellowing and waved their swords. Up 3 slanting meadows, down 4 slanting meadows on the other side, across another road, across a heath of snapping bracken, through a wood, across another road, and to the brink of a big pool, they pursued the flying philosopher. But when he came to the pool his pace was so precipitate that he could not stop it, and with a kind of lurching stagger he fell splash into the greasy water. Getting dripping to his feet, with the water up to his knees, the worshipper of force and victory waded disconsolately to the other side and drew himself onto the bank. And Turnbull sat down on the grass and went off into reverberations of laughter. A second afterwards the most extraordinary grimaces were seen to distort the stiff face of MacIan, and unholy sounds came from within. He had never practised laughing, and it hurt him very much. Chapter 7.